Okay, let's talk a little bit of definitions, which we need in order to discuss social structure. Um, we're going to get further on into different types of social structures, but we have to first define how the individual fits into social structures and how we define a person's place in those social structures. So, and a social structure itself can be anything actually where a lot of people get together. It could be a huge corporation, or it can be a structure between two people. And we're going to talk about that when we talk about the types of groups. But like for interaction between a cashier and a customer would be a type of social structure, or between a patient and a doctor would be a particular type of social structure. And in those social structures, a person has a particular status. In other words, a person has a role, a socially defined position in that group or society, where, according to that position, there are certain expectations, rights, or duties that the person has. So a status is not only higher and lower status. A person can have very high status or low status, and that's the way you normally think of it. But it also can be defined as a particular place in that it could be a lateral or different types of roles which are not necessarily up higher or lower. So these are the statuses. That is the type of definition of a person has. Now, a person can have, we'll sort of get this when I talk about the difference between two types of statuses, and what type of status could be either ascribed or achieved. So an ascribed status would be a person is put in the role because he is born or not done anything. The society puts it on him. So for instance, an ascribed status could be a man or a woman or a cousin. It could be something that he is a particular racial category. In other words, it could be an illness that he's contracted that will define him as a patient, as against, on the other hand, the doctor, it wouldn't be an ascribed status because he worked to achieve it. So in its achieved status, a particular profession, a place within a group, or something like that. So that would be the idea of an achieved status. Okay. Now, it's not so clear cut between the two. There can be gray areas where it's hard to actually differentiate what is ascribed status and what is an achieved status. Or even you can actually work on changing what would be normally an ascribed status to achieved status. In 1959, there was a journalist who took some medicine in order to go through the South as an African American, wrote a book called Black Like Me. So he did something in order to gain a status which was normally an ascribed status, and he made it into an achieved status. Okay, so that's the idea of a status itself, and you can think for yourself what sort of status would be a good thing for you to, good exercise for you to do for yourself. Write down the different type of statuses one might have, and if it's either an ascribed status or an achieved status. Now, amongst these things, between people, right, depending upon, we said that there are different expectations, rights, and duties according to the status, and there would be a process which people act towards each other, respond to other people, right? And these processes which people do that, we call those social interactions, which is a foundation for all relationships in groups in society. And these are determined and modified by the particular social structure. Both the status and the interactions are defined by the social structure, which in itself is a stable pattern of social relationships that exist within the group or society. So we've talked about three different definitions: a status, amongst the described status, and a achieved status. We talked about social interaction, and we talked about social structure. Just want to mention, though, that amongst all these things, for a particular individual, one might have a particular status which colors all the other. Everything else is colored and modified by that particular status, one particular thing which defines that person. And that would be called a master status. So for instance, if a person is a prisoner, that will define everything he does. If a person is whatever it's going to do that's going to make him, for instance, if a person is a mental patient that is obvious enough that he's going to be seen as one, regardless of where he is, that becomes a master status. And of course, within these statuses, we have status symbols. I mean, obviously, if somebody's going to be wearing a $5,000 watch, he's doing it only to demonstrate his status, because after all, a $5,000 watch, if you just want to get to your appointment on time, you don't need no $5,000 watch. But it's not only to be on a high social status. There are low social statuses, or for instance, particular clothing in a gang would show status within the gang. Any sort of, so status symbols, any sort of material, object, accoutrement that informs other people of that person's status. Okay, so there are many of those things which one needs to, one has to look at. Now, a status might determine certain sort of behaviors, but the picture of the whole behaviors are actually what we call the role. In other words, a person has to play out a role. We'll talk about this later, about playing out a role. But the role, the word role in sociology, means it's a set of behavioral expectations associated with a given status. So a person who's a doctor will be expected to check out a patient's physical state and discuss his findings and write out a prescription. That's his role. And there is an expectation by the society or by the group for a person in that role to act in a certain way. Whatever the behaviors the people they are expecting, that's called the role expectation. It's a definition of that role which is to be played. Now, it's possible that the person will act in a certain way in accordance to that role expectation, and it's possible he won't. Whatever he does, that's his role performance. Is he doing a good performance or a bad performance, right? So however he's actually acting within that role is his role performance. Now, as we said, the person can have multiple statuses, which means he could have multiple roles to play. Okay? So, if a person has multiple roles to play, right, there might be multiple statuses, multiple roles, and there might be a conflict between them. So if a person, for instance, is a full-time student and a full-time employee and a full-time parent, right, there could be conflicts between this. You'll not be able to get everything done, okay? So that is going to cause a conflict between the different roles, and we call that role conflict. On the other hand, there might be one particular status that will make incompatible demands on a particular person from one status, okay? And that will be called role strain, okay? So, for instance, it might be that a person is running an organization, right? And he must do his job well, be able to put money into his services. He only has a certain amount of income, and he also has to pay his staff a certain amount. So there's a strain here in order to balance how much money he's going to put into his services, in other words, to his customers, as against how much money he's going to pay his staff. And that's going to be a strain within one status. But one's not wed to the status forever necessarily, and sometimes, in some statuses, one can actually leave that, and that we'll call role exit. Okay, so we're talking about in the definitions of roles, we have the role itself, we have a role expectation, we have the role performance, role conflict, role strain, and role exit. Okay, a third category of definitions we need to talk about, if we're going to have time, is the idea of groups. And a group is anytime you have one or two people together. I think we'll talk about this a little more later. But a group can be a primary group, right, which has face-to-face relationships and strong emotional ties. Okay, so it means like if you're in the military, well, family is obviously the first primary group. But other peer groups or military groups or things similar to that are primary groups when you have a real sort of intimate type of connection. On the other hand, you can have secondary groups which are not you don't have a strong intimate connection with it, but they are something by a particular. They are defined by a particular setting of goals. So, for instance, you go and you are going to the store, and you're a group of shoppers trying to get. There's a group of shoppers going in trying to get a sale, right? So we're working together, going to a concert together. This is a secondary group. All these people standing in line, waiting to buy tickets for the concert. That's a secondary group. We don't necessarily have an ongoing face-to-face emotional connection to everybody standing in line. It could be the group of students in your school. Some of you might wind up with a primary group relationship, but most of them are secondary. They're defined by your status as a student, and it doesn't overflow and influence the rest of your life in the long run. And the fourth component of social structure is the institutions, okay, which are relatively stable groups sustained by people that have come over time and they coordinate the human activity. Now let's just talk about four qualities in the last minute. We have four qualities. All institutions have a history. They have some timeline of development. They have, and as they are developing, they're continuously changing. Second quality, they're continuously changing. Things don't actually stay the same. They are not static. They develop, so the history and the change actually, in a sense, go together. The third thing is that an institution has resources and it has to distribute them, and since they have to distribute them, it won't necessarily distribute them in equal ways. Generally, in unequal ways. And the fourth, actually there are five. The fourth quality, characteristic of institutions is that there are different statuses within the institution. Okay, so within the institution there are privileged statuses, right? And there are people who have less privileged statuses, disadvantaged statuses. So there are going to be people of professors from Ivy League college or professors from state universities, professors from four-year propriety colleges, professors from two-year community colleges, professors from two-year propriety colleges, and there are different statuses within that. And that will change. That will affect the amount of benefits and autonomy a person has according to prestige. And the fifth one, before we finish, is the institutes promote some sort of ideology, a thought pattern, a system which will justify and legitimize their existence. And that's something which helps them to go on and continue and exist and grow and change and allocate these statuses.